Night, before electricity, was not an atmosphere or a poetic idea. It was a physical condition that arrived every evening without exception. When the sun slipped below the horizon, the world did not slowly dim. It withdrew. Shapes softened, distances collapsed, and even familiar places became uncertain once darkness settled in. For most of human history, people did not resist the night. They adapted to it. There were no glowing screens waiting in the background, no steady lamps filling every corner with reassurance. When daylight ended, activity slowed because sight itself reached its natural limit, and the body followed without argument. Modern nights feel strangely crowded. Light leaks from streets, windows, and devices, keeping the mind gently alert long after the body is tired. In the past, night pressed in from all sides. It asked the eyes to close, the hands to rest, and the mind to accept what could no longer be seen. Sleeping before electricity was not a personal choice shaped by comfort or preference. It was a shared rhythm learned over generations. People went to rest when light faded, when work became difficult, and when the familiar sounds of evening replaced the movement of the day. Rest often arrived earlier, but it did not always arrive deeply. Sleep unfolded slowly, shaped by darkness, fatigue, and habit. It was lighter, more attentive, and closely connected to the surrounding world, where silence was rare and awareness never fully disappeared. This story is not about rulers, inventions, or dramatic events. It is about ordinary nights lived by ordinary people. Nights shaped by firelight and shadow, guided by the moon, and measured by the quiet rhythm of breathing and rest shared with others. As we step into this darker world, night becomes less like an absence and more like a presence. A presence that taught humanity when to stop, when to wait, and how to sleep in a world that truly went dark. Darkness before electricity was not symbolic, poetic, or romantic. It was complete. When the sun disappeared, vision did not fade gently into comfort. It ended. Roads vanished a few steps ahead, faces lost their shape, and familiar paths became uncertain once the last light of day withdrew. In many places, night arrived suddenly. There was no gradual glow from windows or streets. Once daylight failed, the world contracted into what could be touched, remembered, or carefully felt. Movement slowed, not from fear, but from necessity, as sight no longer guided the body. Even in towns and cities, darkness ruled. A small number of lanterns might glow at key intersections, creating brief islands of light surrounded by deep shadow. Between them, streets returned to blackness, and travelers moved carefully, guided by memory more than vision. In the countryside, darkness was even more decisive. Fields, forests, and paths disappeared entirely after sunset. Without artificial light, the land became unreadable. The horizon dissolved, and the familiar world of work and travel quietly closed until morning returned. People learned early that night was not meant for constant activity. Tasks narrowed, then stopped. The body adjusted its expectations, conserving energy rather than fighting the limits of vision. Darkness was treated as a condition to respect, not an obstacle to overcome. This acceptance shaped behavior in subtle ways. Voices lowered as sound carried farther in still air. Movements became deliberate and economical. People stayed close to known spaces, avoiding unnecessary travel once darkness had settled fully around them. Darkness also changed how time was experienced. Without visual detail, minutes stretched and waiting felt longer. Rest arrived with a different weight, as the body no longer measured time by clocks, but by fatigue, hunger, and the pull toward stillness. Indoors, darkness was only partially held back. Rooms shrank to the space touched by flame, while corners dissolved into suggestion. Beyond the circle of light, walls and furniture existed more in memory than in sight, quietly waiting for morning. Homes felt familiar, but never fully revealed at night. The house became a collection of known shapes with unknown edges. People moved carefully within these spaces, guided by habit and touch rather than confidence. Children learned the rules of darkness early, guided by adults and routine. They learned where to step, when to pause, and how to wait. Adults never forgot these lessons. Every generation carried the same quiet knowledge into the night. Darkness also encouraged closeness. Families and households gathered into fewer rooms, sharing warmth and presence. Isolation was rare, not by preference, but by design, as safety and comfort were easier to maintain together. Because light was limited, it became valuable. Flames were watched closely, protected from drafts, and extinguished with care. Light was not wasted. It was borrowed briefly from the night, then returned. In a world shaped this way, people learned to live within darkness rather than against it. And as night settled fully each evening, another element quietly joined it, something softer than fear, preparing the body for rest. Fire was the most common companion of the night. Long before electricity, flame provided warmth, light, and a fragile sense of control over darkness. A single candle or hearth fire did not illuminate a room. It created a small island of visibility, surrounded by shadow and uncertainty. This light was never stable. Flames flickered with every movement of air, stretching shadows across walls and ceilings. Objects appeared to move when they did not. Familiar shapes shifted and softened, forcing the mind to interpret what the eyes could no longer clearly define. Firelight changed how people used their space. Activities clustered close to the flame. Faces gathered into its glow, while corners of the room faded into darkness. The rest of the house existed as suggestion, felt rather than seen, present but unreachable. The sound of fire mattered as much as its light. The quiet crackle of wood or wick became part of the evening rhythm. It was a reminder that the flame was alive and needed care, attention, and eventual rest, just like the people around it. Maintaining light required effort. Candles had to be trimmed. Oil lamps needed refilling. Hearth fires demanded careful tending. Light was not passive. It asked for time, materials, and patience, which naturally limited how long it could be kept. Because of this, evenings followed predictable patterns. As the fire weakened, tasks slowed. Conversations softened. The flame signaled when work should end and rest should begin, guiding the household toward sleep without instruction. Firelight also shaped imagination. Shadows invited stories, beliefs, and quiet fears. In low light, the mind filled gaps left by vision. This was not panic, but awareness, a gentle alertness shaped by generations living close to darkness. For children, fire marked safety. For adults, it marked responsibility. The flame had to be watched, banked, or extinguished before sleep. Leaving it unattended invited danger, especially in homes built of wood, straw, and cloth. As bedtime approached, the fire was reduced, not celebrated. Embers were covered. Candles were snuffed. Light slowly retreated, allowing darkness to return in controlled steps rather than sudden collapse. This transition mattered. Moving gradually from light to dark helped the body settle. Eyes adjusted. Breathing slowed. The boundary between day and night felt clear, not blurred by endless illumination. When the flame finally faded, the room did not feel empty. It felt quiet and complete. Darkness resumed its place, and the household accepted it without resistance, guided by habit and trust in routine. Fire had done its work. It had warmed, revealed, and then withdrawn. What remained was a softer awareness, shaped by shadow and memory, ready to give way to rest. And as the last glow disappeared, the night invited people to lie down, carrying with them the shifting images of flame into sleep. Before electricity, bedtime was rarely a personal decision made in isolation. It emerged naturally from the rhythm of the evening. As light faded, households moved through familiar steps that gently carried the day toward its end without urgency or instruction. The final tasks of the day were practical and quiet. Food was stored, tools were set aside, and animals were secured for the night. These actions were not rushed. They followed habits shaped by repetition, each movement signaling that daylight's influence was ending. Indoors, attention shifted toward preparation rather than activity. Bedding was arranged, straw was smoothed, blankets were shaken free of dust, and sleeping spaces were made ready. This work was shared, often done together, reinforcing the sense of collective rest. The fire, once central to evening life, was carefully reduced. Embers were banked, ashes adjusted, and flames lowered to safe warmth. This process marked the household's transition from wakefulness to rest, guided by experience rather than timekeeping. Voices softened as night deepened. Conversations became shorter, less animated, and more reflective. There was no pressure to fill the silence. Quiet was accepted as part of the evening, not something to escape or distract from. Doors and shutters were checked with calm attention. Locks were secured, and familiar sounds of wood settling followed. These small acts offered reassurance, allowing the mind to loosen its grip on alertness. For many, the evening included brief moments of reflection. Prayer, habitual phrases, or simple pauses allowed the day to settle mentally before the body lay down. These rituals were not dramatic, but grounding. As darkness spread, movement slowed. People remained close to one another, sharing warmth and presence. The house contracted into fewer active spaces, encouraging stillness and reducing unnecessary motion. Children followed these routines without explanation. Sleep arrived not as a command, but as an expected outcome of the evening's flow. Adults carried the same pattern, shaped by years of repetition. Without bright light, there was little temptation to extend the evening. Fatigue was respected, not challenged. The body recognized its limits and responded willingly. The absence of stimulation allowed rest to approach gradually. Thoughts quieted. Muscles released tension. The mind shifted from planning to waiting. Lying down felt like a continuation of the evening, not an abrupt stop. Sleep was approached gently, guided by habit rather than force. As the household settled into stillness, the night did not feel empty or uncertain. It felt complete, carrying forward a rhythm older than memory. And within that rhythm, sleep arrived not as an escape, but as the natural conclusion of the day. For many people before electricity, sleep did not arrive as a single, unbroken stretch. It unfolded in parts. After lying down in the early hours of night, the body entered a deep and steady rest often called first sleep, shaped by darkness and fatigue. This initial sleep was usually heavy and restorative. Muscles relaxed fully, breathing slowed, and the mind drifted without resistance. Hours passed quietly, guided by the absence of light and the body's natural rhythm rather than by expectation. Sometime in the middle of the night, waking was common. Eyes opened without alarm. The house was still. The fire was low. This waking period was not seen as a problem, but as a normal part of the night structure. During this quiet interval, people remained calm. Some sat up briefly, tending embers or adjusting blankets. Others spoke softly or simply lay awake, allowing thoughts to pass without urgency. This period of wakefulness was often gentle and reflective. Without strong light or stimulation, the mind wandered slowly. Worries did not press sharply. Awareness remained soft and unhurried. In many households, this waking time carried meaning. Prayer, contemplation, or habitual thoughts found space here. The night felt open, offering a pause between two rests rather than an interruption. After some time, sleep returned naturally. Second sleep was usually lighter than the first, closer to morning, and more easily disturbed by sound or movement. Still, it completed the body's need for rest. This pattern was shaped by long nights and limited light. When darkness lasted many hours, the body adapted by dividing rest rather than forcing continuous sleep. Season and location influenced this rhythm. In winter, the pause between sleeps could feel longer. In summer, it might pass quickly, but the pattern itself was widely familiar. Importantly, this way of sleeping was not universal or identical everywhere. It varied by culture, climate, and household. Still, it appears often enough in historical records to suggest a shared human response to darkness. Only later did uninterrupted sleep become an expectation. Artificial light and fixed schedules slowly reshaped how people understood rest, turning natural waking into something viewed as disruption. Before that shift, waking at night carried no anxiety. It was accepted, even anticipated, as part of the body's dialogue with darkness. The night was not rushed. Time moved differently, measured by sensation rather than by hours. And between these two sleeps, the world remained quiet and waiting, allowing rest to arrive again when it was ready. The past was often quieter than the modern world, but it was never silent. When night settled, sound became more noticeable, filling the absence of light. Without constant noise, even small movements carried meaning, and sleep unfolded in a world shaped as much by listening as by rest. Wood was one of the most common night voices. Beams cooled and shifted, floors creaked softly, and walls responded to changes in temperature. These sounds were familiar, learned over time, and rarely alarming, but they reminded sleepers that structures were alive and always adjusting. Animals added their own rhythm to the night. Dogs shifted near doors, livestock moved in stalls, and insects filled the air with steady patterns. These sounds marked safety as much as presence. Silence, not noise, was often what caused concern. Outside, wind moved through trees, thatch, and open spaces. It brushed against shutters and slipped through small gaps in walls. These sounds changed with weather and season, becoming part of the night's personality rather than an interruption to sleep. In towns, distant human sounds traveled farther after dark. Footsteps, murmured voices, or the closing of a door carried through still air. These noises were not constant, but their rarity made them noticeable. Sleep adapted to this environment. People learned to rest while listening, remaining lightly aware without tension. The body did not shut down completely. It balanced relaxation with readiness, shaped by generations living close to uncertainty. Night sounds also provided reassurance. Familiar patterns meant that life continued normally. A sudden change in sound, rather than noise itself, signaled attention. This awareness was quiet and practiced, not fearful. Children learned these sounds early. They recognized which noises belonged to home and which did not. Over time, this knowledge settled into the body, allowing rest to come more easily. Even during deeper sleep, sound remained present. It flowed through dreams and half-waking moments, connecting the sleeper to the surrounding world without fully pulling them back into awareness. Unlike modern noise, these sounds were rarely sharp or overwhelming. They rose and fell naturally, following wind, movement, and living rhythms rather than machines. Because sound mattered so much, sleeping spaces were chosen carefully. Proximity to animals, doors, or pathways influenced how safe and restful the night felt. The night did not demand silence. It offered a softer kind of listening, where awareness and rest coexisted without conflict. Within this soundscape, sleep found its place, shaped not by isolation, but by connection to the living world outside the bed. And as listening blended into dreaming, the night continued quietly, holding both sound and stillness together. Before electricity, a bed was not always a private or permanent object. Sleep happened wherever space, warmth, and habit allowed. The place where a person lay down mattered less than the conditions around it, and rest adapted to what was available. In many homes, sleeping spaces were simple. Straw pallets were laid on the floor, benches were used near the hearth, and shared mattresses filled small rooms. These arrangements were practical, shaped by limited space and materials rather than by ideals of comfort. Beds were often assembled and disassembled daily. Straw was replaced or refreshed, blankets were folded away, and sleeping areas returned to daytime use. Sleep did not claim a room of its own. It borrowed space temporarily and returned it by morning. Materials varied by wealth and region. Wool, linen, rushes, and straw formed the foundation of rest. Feathers and finer fabrics existed, but they were rare. Even among the wealthy, sleeping comfort was not guaranteed or uniform. The position of the bed mattered. Proximity to the fire offered warmth in winter, while distance reduced smoke and sparks. People learned through experience where sleep felt safest and most sustainable across seasons. Sleeping near walls or corners provided a sense of enclosure. Open spaces felt exposed at night, even indoors. The shape of the room influenced how easily the body relaxed, guided by instinct rather than design. Privacy, as understood today, was uncommon. Curtains or screens sometimes separated sleeping areas, but complete isolation was rare. The presence of others was expected and often reassuring rather than intrusive. Children, servants, and travelers slept wherever space permitted. Hierarchies softened at night, replaced by the practical need to fit bodies into limited shelter. Sleep ignored status when conditions demanded cooperation. Cleanliness was managed carefully, but expectations differed. Bedding was aired, shaken, and replaced when possible. The goal was not perfection, but function, allowing rest to continue despite limited resources. Because beds were shared or reused, sleep was lighter. Movement and breathing were felt and heard. The body adapted by resting without fully surrendering awareness. Despite simplicity, these spaces were familiar. Repetition created comfort. The body learned where it belonged at night, even if the arrangement changed slightly from day to day. Sleeping places were shaped less by choice than by necessity. Yet within those limits, people found rhythms that allowed rest to return reliably. The place of sleep did not need to be ideal. It needed to be predictable, warm enough, and close to others who shared the same night. And in these shared spaces, rest continued, supported by habit, proximity, and the quiet acceptance of the dark. Before electricity, sleeping together was common and expected. It was shaped by space, warmth, and safety rather than by intimacy or preference. The night encouraged closeness, and sharing sleep became part of how households endured darkness. Families often slept in the same room, sometimes in the same bed. Parents, children, and relatives gathered where heat was strongest. This arrangement reduced cold, conserved energy, and made it easier to respond to any disturbance during the night. Shared sleep also offered reassurance. The presence of others softened fear and reduced vulnerability. Familiar breathing, small movements, and quiet sounds confirmed that the household remained intact and alert, even while resting. Warmth played a central role. Bodies shared heat in rooms that were difficult to warm fully. In winter, this closeness was not optional. It was a practical response to long nights and limited fuel. For children, sleeping among others provided security. Night felt less uncertain when surrounded by known voices and forms. For adults, shared sleep reduced the burden of vigilance, spreading awareness across more than one person. Travelers and guests were included in these arrangements. Inns, homes, and barns offered shared sleeping spaces where strangers rested side by side. Privacy yielded to necessity, guided by custom rather than discomfort. This closeness required unspoken rules. Movements were restrained. Voices stayed low. People learned how to share space without conflict, especially at night when rest mattered most. Not everyone welcomed shared sleep, but few questioned it. Cultural expectations shaped tolerance, and habit smoothed discomfort over time. What mattered was rest, not personal boundaries. Shared sleeping spaces also allowed quicker response to danger. Fire, illness, or intrusion could be noticed and addressed without delay. Night was faced collectively rather than alone. Despite closeness, sleep remained light. Breathing, shifting, and murmurs passed easily through awareness. The body learned to rest without full isolation, maintaining a gentle connection to others. As societies changed, sleeping alone became associated with status and comfort. Before that shift, solitude at night was unusual and often unwanted. Shared sleep did not eliminate fear, but it softened it. Darkness felt less overwhelming when faced together, even in silence. The night belonged to the group, not the individual. Rest unfolded within that shared presence, shaped by cooperation rather than separation. And within this closeness, sleep found stability, carried forward by habit and human connection. Before electricity, night demanded preparation. Sleep required a sense of safety, even if that safety was fragile. People did not expect perfect protection, but they relied on routines that reduced risk and allowed the body to rest with less tension. Doors were checked carefully before night fully settled. Wooden bars were set in place, shutters were closed, and simple locks were secured. These actions were repeated nightly, becoming habits that reassured the mind as much as they protected the home. Windows were treated with equal care. Openings were small and often covered, limiting both drafts and visibility. Darkness outside was accepted, but it was kept at a distance through physical boundaries that marked the edge between shelter and uncertainty. Animals played an important role in nighttime security. Dogs rested near entrances, alert to unfamiliar sounds. Their presence offered comfort and early warning, allowing humans to relax slightly while sleeping. In towns and villages, collective vigilance shaped the night. Curfews, bells, and watchmen created a shared awareness that extended beyond individual households. Even while sleeping, people trusted that others remained attentive. Fire posed one of the greatest dangers at night. Flames and embers were managed carefully before sleep. Candles were extinguished, hearths were banked, and glowing coals were covered to prevent sparks from spreading. These precautions were taken seriously, but without panic. They were part of daily life, performed calmly and consistently. Repetition turned concern into routine, allowing rest to follow naturally. Fear existed, but it was measured. People understood the risks of theft, animals, or illness, yet they did not dwell on them endlessly. Night required respect, not constant anxiety. Sleeping lightly was one response to uncertainty. Awareness lingered just below rest, ready to surface if needed. This balance between relaxation and readiness was learned over generations. Children absorbed these habits early. Watching adults prepare for night taught them how safety was maintained without alarm. Over time, these lessons settled into instinct. Community reduced vulnerability. Knowing neighbors slept nearby offered reassurance. Help was closer than it felt, even in darkness. These layers of protection did not eliminate danger, but they made it manageable. They allowed sleep to arrive without surrendering all awareness. Night remained unpredictable, yet familiar. Through routine and shared responsibility, people found ways to rest despite uncertainty. And once these preparations were complete, the body could finally release itself into the quiet of sleep. Night before electricity invited the mind to work differently. With limited sight and fewer distractions, imagination filled the spaces left by darkness. Thoughts slowed, but they also deepened, shaped by belief, memory, and quiet expectation. Many people understood night as a time when the unseen felt closer. Without clear vision, ordinary sounds and shadows gained meaning. This was not always fear, but awareness, a sensitivity shaped by living without constant reassurance. Beliefs about spirits, omens, or divine presence often gathered at night. These ideas varied by culture and place, but they shared a common purpose. They helped explain what could not be seen and offered structure to uncertainty. Small rituals brought comfort. Words spoken before sleep, familiar gestures, or protective objects near the bed allowed the mind to settle. These acts were simple and habitual, not dramatic, but they carried emotional weight. Dreams were taken seriously. Many believed they carried messages, warnings, or insight. Sleep was not empty time. It was a space where meaning might emerge quietly, without effort or control. Because dreams mattered, falling asleep required care. Thoughts were guided gently, often toward prayer, reflection, or familiar ideas. This preparation shaped the emotional tone of rest. Fear existed, but it was rarely loud. The mind learned to coexist with uncertainty rather than fight it. Darkness was not always threatening. It was a condition that invited humility and patience. Children absorbed these beliefs naturally. Stories told by adults framed the night as something to understand, not avoid. Over time, these narratives shaped how sleep felt emotionally safe. Imagination did not vanish in daylight. But at night, it held more influence. Without strong visual input, the inner world became more vivid, shaping dreams and half-waking thoughts. Despite varied beliefs, a shared pattern remained. Night was treated with respect. Sleep was approached thoughtfully, not casually, acknowledging its connection to the unseen. As societies changed, many of these beliefs faded. Artificial light reduced mystery, pushing imagination to the margins. Yet the night mind still responds to darkness in similar ways. Even now, reduced light softens thought and invites reflection. The body remembers older patterns, shaped long before modern certainty. In the past, these patterns were lived nightly. Belief and rest intertwined naturally, allowing sleep to arrive with meaning as well as calm. And as eyes closed, the mind drifted gently, carrying the quiet stories of the night into dreams. Winter transformed the night more than any other season. As daylight shortened, darkness claimed a greater share of time. Evenings began earlier, mornings arrived later, and sleep stretched across long, uninterrupted hours shaped by cold and silence. In winter, rest was not only about recovery. It was about preservation. Cold demanded stillness, and the body responded by conserving energy. Sleep became heavier, longer, and more deeply tied to survival rather than comfort. Homes struggled to hold warmth through the night. Fires burned low, blankets layered thickly, and bodies gathered closer together. Each measure softened the cold, allowing sleep to continue despite harsh conditions outside. Getting up during winter nights was avoided whenever possible. Leaving the warmth of bedding meant confronting cold air and stiff muscles. This reinforced longer periods of rest and fewer interruptions once sleep had begun. Darkness lingered well into morning. Waking did not mean immediate light. The day began slowly, often by sound or habit rather than sight. The body adjusted, accepting extended rest as necessary. Winter also amplified silence. Snow softened outdoor sounds, and fewer animals moved at night. This quiet deepened sleep, but it could also make unfamiliar noises more noticeable. Seasonal sleep patterns shifted naturally. First and second sleep often felt longer, with more time spent resting between waking and dawn. The night allowed the body to recover from demanding days. Food and warmth shaped winter rest. Heavy meals and warm drinks before bed helped sustain the body through cold hours. Sleep followed digestion and warmth rather than strict schedules. Clothing worn to bed mattered more in winter. Nightcaps, wool garments, and layered fabrics reduced heat loss, allowing the body to remain still and relaxed. Fear of winter nights was practical, not imagined. Exposure, illness, and fire risk carried real consequences. These concerns encouraged caution and reinforced routines that supported rest. Despite hardship, winter nights also offered a kind of stillness. Activity slowed. Time stretched. Sleep felt like refuge rather than interruption. The long dark encouraged reflection. With little to do, the mind settled into quieter patterns, shaped by repetition and endurance. As seasons turned, these winter habits faded, but the body remembered how darkness and cold reshaped rest. And when spring returned, sleep shifted again, guided by light, warmth, and renewal. Summer changed the character of night in quieter but noticeable ways. As daylight lingered longer, darkness arrived later and retreated sooner. Sleep adjusted gently, guided by warmth, air, and the softer edges of summer evenings. Heat shaped how people rested. Heavy bedding was reduced, and sleeping positions shifted to release warmth. The body sought stillness without insulation, allowing rest to come without discomfort as temperatures remained mild through the night. Windows, doors, and shutters were often opened when weather allowed. Fresh air moved through rooms, carrying outdoor sounds and scents. This openness cooled the body while keeping sleepers connected to the world beyond the walls. In warmer regions or during intense heat, sleep sometimes moved outdoors. Courtyards, porches, or shaded ground offered relief. These spaces provided airflow and cooling, making rest possible when indoor rooms held trapped warmth. Summer nights brought different sounds. Insects filled the air with steady rhythms, and distant activity lingered longer after sunset. These sounds became part of the night's texture, blending into rest rather than interrupting it. Light also behaved differently. Even after sunset, the sky often held a faint glow. Moonlight and lingering twilight softened darkness, allowing movement and awareness to continue later into the evening. Because evenings extended, bedtime often arrived later. Yet sleep still followed fatigue rather than choice. When the body tired, rest came naturally, guided by warmth and habit instead of clocks. Clothing worn to bed reflected the season. Lightweight fabrics replaced wool, and bare skin touched cooler surfaces. These small adjustments allowed the body to release heat and settle into sleep more easily. Summer also altered first and second sleep. The waking period between rests often shortened as darkness itself shortened. Sleep became more continuous, shaped by shorter nights and earlier dawn. Food and drink changed as well. Lighter meals and cool water prepared the body for rest without heaviness. Digestion aligned with temperature, influencing how quickly sleep arrived. Despite openness, safety remained a concern. Doors and gates were still secured, even when windows stayed open. Awareness balanced comfort, allowing rest without full exposure. Morning arrived sooner in summer. Birds, light, and early activity signaled waking before the body felt fully restored. Sleep adjusted again, responding to seasonal rhythm rather than resistance. As heat faded toward dawn, rest often deepened briefly. The coolest hours offered the most comfortable sleep, quietly completing the night. And with sunrise, summer nights released their hold, giving way to light and renewed movement. Before electricity, the sky itself marked the passage of time. The sun, moon, and stars provided guidance long before clocks became common. Night was not empty. It was mapped by light that shifted slowly across the sky. Moonlight held particular importance. A bright moon could transform the night, revealing paths, rooftops, and fields. People adjusted their behavior accordingly, extending activity when the moon allowed safer movement. When the moon was absent or hidden, darkness returned fully. Nights without moonlight felt heavier and more uncertain. Sleep arrived earlier, and travel became rare, guided by caution rather than curiosity. Stars offered orientation rather than brightness. Familiar constellations helped people understand direction and season. Even without precise measurement, the sky communicated where one stood within the larger rhythm of the year. Cloud cover changed everything. A covered sky removed both moon and stars, deepening darkness. These nights were quieter, slower, and more inward, encouraging stillness and early rest. The sky also signaled weather. Shifting winds, rising clouds, or sudden stillness hinted at change. Sleep unfolded alongside this awareness, shaped by the expectation of morning conditions. Because the sky governed light, it governed rest. People learned to align their sleep with celestial patterns rather than abstract numbers. Time was felt, not counted. In many cultures, night prayers and rituals followed the stars. Certain hours were marked not by clocks, but by the position of the moon or the depth of darkness. This relationship created patience. Without exact minutes, there was less urgency. Waiting felt natural, and rest filled spaces that might otherwise be spent watching time pass. The sky also unified experience. No matter where people lived, the same moon rose overhead. Night connected distant communities through shared observation. Children learned these patterns early, watching adults reference the sky with familiarity. Over time, this knowledge settled quietly into memory. As artificial light spread, the sky lost influence. Night became independent of celestial rhythm, shaped instead by human design. Yet the body still responds to moonlight and darkness. Subtle changes continue to affect rest, even when unnoticed. In the past, this connection was constant. Sleep followed the sky, guided by light that could never be controlled. And as the night deepened, the sky remained above, silently marking time until dawn returned. Before electricity and precise timekeeping, most people did not organize their lives around numbers. Hours were not counted with accuracy. Instead, time was understood through routine, light, sound, and physical sensation. Waking rarely depended on a device. Morning arrived through gradual cues. Light crept into rooms, birds began to move, and familiar sounds signaled the return of activity. The body responded naturally, easing out of rest. In towns, bells played a central role. Church bells marked prayer, work, and rest, shaping collective rhythm rather than personal schedule. These sounds reached sleepers gently, guiding waking without urgency. In rural areas, time followed labor. Animals needed attention, fields demanded care, and weather influenced decisions. Sleep ended when work required it, not when a number appeared. The body learned to recognize its own signals. Fatigue, hunger, and alertness shaped decisions more than abstract measures. Rest was taken when needed and released when energy returned. Without exact hours, waiting felt different. There was no pressure to fill every moment. Stillness was acceptable. Sleep could linger without guilt, shaped by necessity rather than expectation. This flexibility reduced anxiety. Missing a precise moment carried little consequence. Life flowed within broader windows of time rather than strict boundaries. Night followed the same principle. People lay down when darkness deepened and rose when light allowed. Sleep aligned with environment rather than resistance to it. Children learned these rhythms through observation. They watched adults respond to light, sound, and habit, absorbing a sense of time that felt natural rather than imposed. Seasonal shifts adjusted everything. Longer days stretched activity. Shorter days encouraged rest. Time expanded and contracted without conflict. As clocks slowly entered daily life, they brought structure but also pressure. Sleep became something to manage rather than experience. Before that shift, rest followed trust. The body knew when to sleep and when to wake, guided by cues refined over generations. Even today, removing clocks softens awareness. Time loosens its grip, and the body begins to listen inward again. In the past, this listening was constant. Sleep unfolded within a world where time was felt, not measured. And as the night moved on, the body rested freely, unconcerned with numbers waiting to be counted. In religious communities, sleep followed a different rhythm. Monasteries and convents treated night as part of discipline rather than private rest. Sleep existed alongside duty, shaped by structure, repetition, and shared purpose. Monastic schedules divided the night. Periods of rest were interrupted by prayer, reading, or quiet movement through dark corridors. These awakenings were expected, not resisted, and carried spiritual meaning. Dormitories were simple and shared. Beds were narrow, often separated only by space rather than walls. Silence was valued, but presence was constant, reinforcing community even in rest. The body adapted to this pattern. Sleep became lighter and more responsive. Waking during the night did not bring confusion or anxiety. It followed routine, guided by bells rather than impulse. Darkness in monasteries was deep and controlled. Light was used sparingly, preserving night's quiet atmosphere. Candles illuminated paths briefly, then withdrew, allowing darkness to reclaim the space. Prayer shaped the transition between sleep and wakefulness. Thoughts were guided gently toward reflection, easing the mind back into rest once duties were complete. Discipline reduced uncertainty. Knowing when and why one would wake allowed the body to relax more fully during rest. Sleep did not feel fragile. It felt supported by structure. These routines were demanding, but they were stable. Over time, repetition softened effort. The body learned to move between rest and wakefulness without resistance. Season affected monastic sleep as well. Longer nights brought more extended rest, while summer shortened darkness and shifted schedules subtly. Despite strict rules, exhaustion was recognized. Periods of illness or age allowed adjustments, showing that even disciplined systems respected bodily limits. For those outside monasteries, this rhythm seemed severe. For those within, it offered clarity. Night was purposeful, not empty. This structured approach highlighted how sleep could be shaped intentionally, rather than passively endured. While most people did not live this way, monastic life reveals how flexible human sleep can be when guided by belief and routine. And beyond monastery walls, other forms of night rest unfolded, shaped not by discipline, but by movement and travel. Travel changed the experience of sleep in fundamental ways. Away from familiar walls and routines, rest became more cautious and adaptive. For most of history, journeys were slow, uncertain, and physically demanding, and sleep followed these conditions closely. Roads offered little comfort. Travelers often slept wherever they stopped, guided by daylight rather than destination. Fields, barns, roadside shelters, and the open ground itself became temporary resting places. Inns provided shelter, but not privacy. Shared rooms were common, filled with strangers resting side by side. Beds were reused, and cleanliness varied widely. Sleep arrived through exhaustion more than ease. Noise was unavoidable. Snoring, movement, and unfamiliar sounds filled the night. The body learned to rest despite interruption, remaining lightly aware in unfamiliar surroundings. Security shaped sleep on the road. Valuables stayed close. Travelers chose positions that allowed quick movement if needed. Awareness lingered, even during rest. Animals often shared these spaces. Horses, donkeys, and livestock rested nearby, their presence offering both comfort and disruption. Their sounds blended into the night's rhythm. Firelight was managed carefully. In crowded inns or barns, flames were reduced early to prevent danger. Darkness returned quickly, encouraging rest through limitation rather than design. Weather added uncertainty. Rain, cold, or wind could turn sleep shallow and fragmented. Travelers adapted by resting in shorter periods, accepting discomfort as temporary. Despite hardship, travel sleep followed familiar patterns. First and second sleep still appeared when conditions allowed, shaped by fatigue and darkness rather than location. Trust played a role. Groups rested more easily than individuals. Shared vigilance reduced risk, allowing deeper rest even in unfamiliar places. Morning arrived early on the road. Light signaled movement. Sleep ended when visibility returned, not when rest felt complete. Repeated journeys trained the body. Experienced travelers learned how to sleep quickly and lightly, conserving energy for the next day. This flexibility reveals how adaptable human sleep can be. Rest adjusted to movement, uncertainty, and shared space without losing its essential function. And as travelers lay down beneath unfamiliar roofs or open skies, the night carried them briefly before the road called again. If sleep on land followed habit and enclosure, the sea demanded something else entirely. The ground never stayed still, and the body had to adapt to constant motion. For sailors and passengers alike, rest became an act of balance rather than surrender. On most vessels, sleeping spaces were limited. Sailors rested wherever room allowed, often on decks, near cargo, or below in cramped holds. Comfort mattered less than stability and proximity to work. Hammocks became a practical solution. Suspended from beams, they moved with the ship rather than against it. This gentle motion helped the body settle, reducing the strain of rolling waves. Below deck, air was heavy and dark. Light was scarce, and ventilation poor. Sleep arrived through exhaustion, shaped by heat, smell, and the persistent creak of wood and rope. Noise never fully faded at sea. Water struck the hull rhythmically, rope shifted, and timbers groaned under pressure. These sounds became familiar, blending into rest rather than interrupting it. Sailors slept in short intervals. Watches divided the night, requiring frequent waking. Rest was shared across rotating shifts, teaching the body to recover quickly when given the chance. Security remained a concern even while resting. Storms, collisions, and changing winds demanded readiness. Sleep stayed light, balanced between rest and alertness. Personal space was minimal. Bodies rested close together, sharing warmth and limited room. Privacy was nearly non-existent, replaced by habit and cooperation. Weather shaped sleep dramatically. Calm seas allowed deeper rest, while storms shattered it entirely. During rough nights, sailors braced themselves rather than fully lying down. Fresh air mattered. Those who slept on deck preferred open sky despite cold or dampness. Below deck, air could grow stifling, making sleep shallow and uneasy. Passengers unfamiliar with the sea struggled most. Nausea, fear, and unfamiliar motion made rest difficult. Over time, some adapted, while others never fully did. Despite hardship, sleep at sea followed familiar patterns. The body still sought rest in cycles, shaped by darkness and fatigue rather than comfort. This ability to rest in motion kept trade, exploration, and survival possible across oceans. And as the ship moved steadily through darkness, sailors slept where they could, trusting the vessel to carry them through the night. For many people in the past, the night was never entirely given to sleep. Vigilance remained necessary, and rest was often divided by responsibility. Guards, sailors, watchmen, and caregivers learned to sleep in fragments rather than in long, protected stretches. Night watches followed strict rotation. Each person rested knowing their turn would come. This expectation shaped sleep, making it lighter but more efficient, trained to recover quickly between periods of alertness. Waking during the night was not sudden or alarming. It followed routine signals such as bells, calls, or familiar sounds. The body learned to respond without confusion, shifting smoothly from rest to awareness. During watches, the world felt different. Darkness sharpened listening. Movement slowed. Attention focused on subtle change rather than constant action. These quiet hours carried weight, even when little happened. After a watch ended, sleep resumed wherever possible. Rest returned quickly, driven by fatigue rather than comfort. The body learned to enter sleep without resistance, accepting interruption as normal. This pattern shaped long-term adaptation. People accustomed to broken sleep often rested more deeply during short periods. The body adjusted, extracting rest efficiently rather than demanding continuity. Shared responsibility reduced strain. Knowing others would take over allowed deeper rest during available moments. Vigilance became collective rather than individual. Weather and season influenced watches. Cold nights demanded movement to stay warm. Warm nights tested alertness. Sleep adjusted again, shaped by environment. In towns, watchmen walked streets slowly, listening for signs of trouble. Their presence allowed others to rest more fully, trusting that someone remained awake. At sea, watches governed everything. Sleep followed the rhythm of the ship rather than personal need. This structure kept vessels moving safely through darkness. Despite interruption, exhaustion did not always overwhelm. Routines softened strain. The body accepted this rhythm, guided by necessity rather than preference. Modern expectations often view broken sleep as failure. In the past, it was normal, practical, and widely understood. Rest did not require perfection. It required adaptability, patience, and trust in shared responsibility. And as watches turned quietly through the night, sleep continued in fragments, carrying people forward until dawn returned. Life before electricity placed steady demands on the body. Work was physical, days were shaped by weather, and rest followed necessity rather than desire. Fatigue was familiar, expected, and managed rather than avoided. People understood their limits through experience. Exhaustion was not ignored, but it was rarely dramatized. The body slowed when it needed to, and sleep followed as a natural response to effort and depletion. Rest was not always immediate. Evening routines allowed fatigue to settle gradually. Muscles released tension slowly, guided by warmth, stillness, and habit rather than sudden collapse. Sleep often arrived deeply after long labor. Physical work prepared the body for rest, reducing mental agitation. The simplicity of exhaustion softened thought, allowing sleep to come without struggle. When fatigue lingered, adjustments were made. Work paused briefly, movement slowed, and additional rest was taken when possible. Recovery was understood as part of endurance, not weakness. Illness and injury changed sleep dramatically. Pain or fever disrupted rest, forcing the body to adapt again. Communities recognized these limits, offering support that allowed healing to occur. Long-term fatigue shaped sleep patterns. People accustomed to hard labor learned how to rest efficiently, entering sleep quickly and waking ready to continue. Despite hardship, the body rarely reached the constant overstimulation common today. Fatigue came from effort, not from endless attention or noise. Sleep followed a clear physical need. Seasonal labor intensified fatigue. Harvests, travel, and construction demanded long days. Sleep during these periods became especially restorative, carrying the body through demanding cycles. Mental exhaustion existed, but it was different. Without constant information, the mind tired more gently. Rest addressed both body and thought together. Communal life helped manage fatigue. Tasks were shared, allowing brief relief when possible. Rest became a collective responsibility rather than an individual failure. Sleep did not erase fatigue completely. It restored enough strength to continue. Endurance depended on rhythm rather than perfection. The body learned resilience through repetition. Fatigue came, rest followed, and work resumed without judgment. And within this cycle, sleep remained a quiet ally, repairing what effort slowly wore away. The night did not disappear all at once. It changed slowly. The first artificial lights did not erase darkness, but they softened its edges. Candles became cheaper, oil lamps improved, and evening stretched slightly beyond its old limits. At first, this change felt small. A little more light allowed tasks to continue briefly after sunset. Reading, sewing, or quiet conversation extended into the night without immediately reshaping sleep. Over time, these extensions accumulated. Bedtime shifted later. The clear boundary between day and night blurred, and sleep began to respond not only to fatigue, but to available light. Artificial light introduced choice. Darkness no longer dictated rest as strongly. People gained the ability to resist night rather than accept it, even when the body still felt its pull. This new freedom also brought tension. Staying awake became possible, but not always restful. Sleep arrived later, sometimes lighter, and waking during the night felt unfamiliar. The body adapted slowly. Older rhythms persisted beneath new habits. First and second sleep did not vanish at once. They faded gradually, reshaped by longer evenings. Night work expanded. Study, craft, and social life pushed further into darkness. Sleep compressed to accommodate these demands, changing its structure without losing its purpose. Urban areas felt this shift first. Light gathered in streets and windows, altering the shared experience of night. Rural life followed more slowly, holding older patterns longer. With more light came more stimulation. Thought lingered later, carrying activity into bed that once would have settled earlier. Yet the body continued to resist extremes. Fatigue still demanded rest. Sleep asserted itself, even when delayed. This moment was not a rupture, but a transition. Old and new rhythms overlapped, shaping nights that felt unfamiliar yet still connected to the past. Darkness lost some authority, but it did not disappear. It waited beyond the glow, present but diminished. And within this changing night, a new understanding of sleep began to form, one that still shapes how rest is experienced today. Sleep before electricity was shaped by darkness, not designed against it. The night guided rest gently, setting limits that the body learned to trust. In that world, sleep followed rhythm rather than resistance, unfolding in ways that felt natural and expected. People did not ask much of the night. They accepted its presence, its silence, and its uncertainty. Rest arrived when light faded, when work ended, and when the body softened into stillness without negotiation. Over generations, these patterns became memory. The body learned how to sleep with sound, with others nearby, with interruption, and with darkness fully present. Sleep adapted, not as a luxury, but as a necessity woven into daily life. Artificial light changed many of these habits, but it did not erase them completely. Beneath modern routines, older rhythms remain. The body still responds to darkness, quiet, and gradual transition when given the chance. Moments without light still soften thought. Reduced stimulation still invites rest. Even now, sleep deepens when night feels whole rather than extended or resisted. Looking back, these earlier ways of resting reveal flexibility rather than hardship. Humans learned to sleep in shared spaces, in motion, in fragments, and across long nights shaped by season and sky. There was no perfect sleep, only adaptive sleep. Rest arrived differently each night, responding to work, weather, belief, and environment. Yet it arrived reliably enough to carry life forward. In remembering these nights, we are not asked to return to them. We are simply reminded that sleep does not require control to exist. It requires permission. And as this quiet journey through the past comes to rest, the night remains what it has always been. A space where the body slows, the world softens, and sleep waits patiently to be received.